Right now, for every single dollar the global economy spends trying to, save nature, it spends roughly $30 actively destroying it.
Yeah, it's wild. A massive $7.3 trillion mismatch.
It really is. So welcome to the deep dive. Today, our mission is to decode the latest, most critical shift in climate and natural finance.
Right, we've been looking at a stack of fresh briefings from the first week of July 2026.
And they really capture a pivotal moment, don't they? The global conversation has fundamentally shifted. It's no longer about whether we can invest in nature.
Exactly. It's about how those investments can actually survive once they land on the ground.
Yeah, so if you are designing a project or moving capital or just, trying to understand why massive green investments keep failing and how to fix them, this is your practical playbook. Okay, let's unpack this.
Well, the landscape of nature finance is just undergoing a complete paradigm shift right now.
Totally.
Over the last few weeks, we've analyzed these high-level meetings,
Okay.
everything from a massive finance fortnight in London to a really focused symposium up in York.
And the consensus is pretty striking.
It really is. The primary bottleneck for nature projects is no longer uh, proving to a bank that they are investable. The new binding constraint, the one thing that will make or break a project, is local legitimacy.
Yeah, and when you visualize that 30 to 1 funding gap we mentioned at the start, it completely reframes the whole challenge.
It forces you to look at things differently.
Right. So the UN Environment Program laid out this startling data in their latest stock take. They found that in 2023, nature-based solutions drew about $220 billion in protective capital.
Which sounds like a lot, but
But moving in the exact opposite direction, $7.3 trillion was spent on activities that degrade nature.
yeah, that 30-to-1 ratio.
I like to think of it as you're basically trying to bail out a sinking ship with a teacup while someone else is actively drilling holes in the hull with a jackhammer.
That is a very bleak but very accurate way to put it.
Right. Because the protective capital is so incredibly scarce compared to the degrading capital, every single dollar you deploy has to be perfectly anchored. Which leads to the question of who is anchoring it.
And that sheer disparity is exactly what drove the conversation shift between London and York.
How so? Like, what was the difference between the two?
Well, the meetings in London were heavily focused on the ledger itself, merging climate and nature into a single agenda, proving that ecological preservation could be a viable financial instrument.
And they've kind of won that argument, haven't they?
They essentially have. Private investment in nature is rising fast. A flagship report from Forest Trends and the Nature Conservancy tracked a five-fold increase over a decade.
Wow.
Yeah, representing a cumulative $62.7 billion in private investment.
And the briefing noted that more than 14 billion of that was deployed in 2025 alone. Plus, looking ahead, there's over 180 billion earmarked for the future.
Right, surveyed across institutions holding a staggering $207 trillion in assets.
So the financial appetite to fund these projects is undeniably there. The money is waiting.
The appetite is massive.
Mm.
But, and this is the key, when the field decamped from London and went to the symposium in York, which was hosted by the Nature-Based Solutions Initiative at Oxford and the British Ecological Society.
Quite a mouthful.
Yeah, but a very important group. Anyway, the agenda there moved completely away from the financial ledgers. Practitioners stopped asking if they could get the money and started asking four very specific questions.
Okay, what were they?
Who benefits?
No.
Who decides?
Yeah.
Who pays? And what is missing?
Yeah.
The realization is that the $180 billion in earmarked capital only becomes durable, lasting finance if the integration on the ground is legitimate.
Meaning if capital arrives in a region without a clear, locally negotiated answer to who benefits, it doesn't stay.
Exactly. It gets rejected by the local environment.
It's like, think of community consent as the operating system of a computer. You can have billions of dollars in cutting-edge financing, the most mathematically perfect carbon yield models, but that is all just hardware.
I love that analogy.
If the local operating system, like the community trust, rejects your software, the entire machine just becomes an expensive brick.
Exactly. But knowing that capital flees without local legitimacy is one thing. Building that legitimacy from day one is the actual challenge here.
Right. So we need to move from the theoretical funding gap to the practical steps required before a single dollar even changes hands.
And this brings us to the core instruction coming out of York. The scarce skill in climate finance isn't structuring the asset anymore. It's answering those distributional questions.
They have to answer them before the capital arrives.
Yes, explicitly.
Okay, but let me push back on that sequence for a second. Given the urgency of the environmental crisis, that 30-to-1 ratio where the jackhammer is actively running, isn't it significantly faster for developers to just secure the funding
You
first?
mean just get the money flowing?
Yeah, get the project started to stop the bleeding, and then figure out the community benefit sharing later once the money is actually there. Like, why delay deploying the capital to negotiate governance?
It's a common argument, honestly. It's heavily driven by the pressure to just deploy capital quickly. But the findings from York completely reject that approach.
Really? Why?
Because treating the community as an afterthought, what practitioners call bolt-on benefit sharing, it fails the legitimacy test every single time.
Bolt-on benefit sharing. That makes sense.
Yeah, imagine a traditional infrastructure project where developers build a massive facility and then halfway through decide to sponsor a local school to win favor.
Right, a classic PR move.
Exactly. You cannot apply that logic to nature finance. If you do not sequence governance first, the project will collapse. It doesn't matter how urgent the environmental crisis is.
Okay, so let's break down the actual essential steps for the project designers and developers listening to this. How do they mechanically sequence this governance?
There are a few specific methods and milestones required. First, practitioners have to document exactly who decides.
What does that look like in practice?
It means formally writing the local residents into the project charter as the leaders of governance, establishing local boards with real veto power.
Real veto power, not just advisory roles. Got it.
Exactly. Second, they have to name who benefits and price who pays. This isn't just a vague promise of future jobs.
Like saying, we'll boost the local economy.
Right. You can't just say that. It requires detailing in writing the exact percentage of revenue or ecological benefits that will be distributed locally.
And the third step.
Third, and perhaps most importantly, they must secure FPIC. That's free, prior, and informed consent.
Right. The briefings are very specific about FPIC. They state it has to be integrated into the core financial account of the project itself.
Yes, not just a separate PDF sitting in some compliance folder somewhere.
Which means physically hardwiring the consent into the revenue model. For a climate asset like a carbon credit to actually be minted, verified, and sold on a registry, there has to be documented, audited proof that the local community's payout conditions were met first.
Exactly. It operates as a strict prerequisite in the financial waterfall. If we connect this to the bigger picture, a financial claim that satisfies a Treasury Department or an insurer in London is ultimately useless if it doesn't also satisfy the local community and their rights regime.
Because if you secure that consent first, the climate mitigation asset actually becomes something the local community wants to defend?
Precisely. They protect the project from illegal logging or agricultural expansion because the asset is fundamentally theirs now.
That makes so much sense. But creating a governance framework on a whiteboard in York is, relatively straightforward.
Oh, absolutely. The real world is much messier.
Exactly. To see why bolt-on benefit sharing actually fails, we have to look at the physical geography of where this money is landing. Here's where it gets really interesting. Let's focus on the incredibly dense, high-stakes mud of Southeast Asia.
Southeast Asia is the ultimate testing ground for these rules. It holds the actual physical assets that all these financial hubs are debating, and it presents this deeply complex web of ecosystems and human livelihoods.
The numbers coming out of the region are just staggering. There's this peer-reviewed study cited in the briefings, led by the National University of Singapore.
The one about peat swamp forests.
Yes. They found that conserving and restoring Southeast Asia's peat swamp forests and mangroves could mitigate roughly 770 million tons of carbon dioxide equivalent every single year.
Which is huge.
It's more than half of the entire region's land use emissions. But the most critical detail here, to me at least, is that all of this mitigation potential is packed into ecosystems that cover just 5% of its land area.
Right. It is incredibly dense, high-value ecological real estate.
5%, that's it.
And that density creates a really unique phenomenon. You can call it a triple threat in a single hectare.
Okay, break that down.
So within 1 hectare of Southeast Asian mangrove, you have 3 massive, distinct values overlapping. First, you have carbon mitigation, literally pulling emissions out of the atmosphere.
Sure.
Second, you have coastal adaptation. The dense root systems buffer the coastlines against rising seas, storm surges, extreme weather.
Check. And the third.
Biodiversity. These mangroves function as vital nurseries that feed the local and commercial fisheries.
So you have a climate asset, an infrastructure asset, and a food security asset all stacked on top of each other in the exact same location.
Yes, which perfectly illuminates the land tenure challenge. Because these ecosystems serve so many vital overlapping functions, whoever holds the land tenure essentially governs all of it.
Right, so a corporation can't simply purchase blue carbon credits in a mangrove forest, put a legal or even a literal fence around it to protect the trees, and claim a win.
No, absolutely not. If that fence shuts down the local fishery, or the community loses access to the land they rely on for their daily livelihoods, the project's legitimacy vanishes instantly.
Because they'll just cut the fence.
They will literally cut the fence. Blue carbon deals in these peat and mangrove forests fail immediately when benefit sharing is an afterthought, because the survival of the community is tied to that exact same hectare of land.
And the briefing mentioned peat swamps specifically.
Yes, peat swamps are another critical example. If a peat swamp is drained for agriculture, the highly carbon-rich soil dries out and becomes a massive fire risk.
Wow, yeah.
Keeping the carbon in the ground requires meticulous daily management of the water tables. You cannot manage that from a desk in New York.
You physically need people there.
Exactly. You have to rely on the local communities who live on the peat to maintain those water levels. If they aren't leading the governance and receiving direct benefits, they won't do it. The forest burns and the carbon asset turns to literal ash.
That's a powerful image. And the briefing highlighted a really compelling live example of this tension. The United Nations Development Program currently has an ecosystem-based adaptation concept for the Gulf of Thailand.
Right, priced at about $10 million.
Yeah. It's under review right now by the Adaptation Fund.
And it perfectly captures both the ambition of the region and the reality of the funding pipeline. It's a highly detailed $10 million proposal focused on these exact overlapping coastal assets. But, and this is a big but, it is just a concept under review.
Right, it's not yet approved dispersed capital.
Exactly.
It just goes to show that even with high-quality ecosystem-based adaptation designs, getting the capital to actually clear the final hurdles in land is a rigorous, slow process.
Very slow.
So if I am a practitioner or even a sovereign nation looking at these projects, I can't just have thousands of isolated, fragile community contracts scattered across the coastline, right?
That would be a logistical nightmare.
Yeah. So if this is going to attract that $180 billion in earmarked capital, there has to be a way to roll these local agreements up and make them bulletproof. I imagine the only way to do that is to bake these local terms into the country's actual laws or international pledges.
You hit the nail on the head. The instruction for ASEAN practitioners, and really practitioners globally, focuses exactly on that transition from project level to national level scaling.
So how do they do it?
The distributional answers in community terms must be built into the initial project design, like we talked about, but then they must be explicitly anchored in national policy frameworks.
You mean like the NDCs and NAPs?
Exactly. They need to be integrated into nationally determined contributions, NDCs, and national adaptation plans, NAPs.
Just as a quick reminder for you listening, the NDCs and NAPs are the big national pledges under the Paris Agreement. They're the official blueprints showing how a country plans to cut emissions and adapt to climate impacts.
Right. And when a country takes these deeply negotiated local benefit sharing agreements and weaves them directly into their official NDCs and NAPs, it hits a massive governance milestone.
It elevates it.
It does. It signals to the global markets that the sovereign government recognizes the local tenure. It proves the region can absorb integrated finance on terms their communities will actually defend.
So it scales the legitimacy from a single mangrove forest up to the entire sovereign framework.
Yes, which greatly reduces the risk for incoming capital.
And as they scale these frameworks, the actual definition of what they are trying to protect and what they can potentially monetize is expanding. The ledger of what counts as a climate asset is getting broader.
Oh, definitely.
I was really struck by a detail from a recent gathering at the Bonn Climate Session in mid-June. A group of 287 scientists issued a formal statement arguing that animal-mediated processes need to be included in official climate accounting.
That completely shifts the boundaries of mitigation science.
It really does. They're pointing to ecological functions like seed dispersal by specific bird species or the grazing and trampling patterns of large herbivores.
Right, because let's look at the mechanics of why that matters. Take a tropical forest where a significant amount of the carbon storage relies on large animals eating fruit and dispersing the seeds of massive hardwood trees.
Okay, so the animals are doing the planting.
Essentially, yes. If those specific animals disappear from the ecosystem, the large trees eventually fail to regenerate, and the carbon storage capacity of the entire forest plummets over time.
So it's not just the trees storing the carbon, it's the animals maintaining the forest that allows the trees to store the carbon.
Exactly. The mitigation frontier is widening to include these dynamic living processes.
Which fundamentally breaks traditional top-down carbon accounting, doesn't it? I mean, satellite imagery can measure the density of a tree canopy from space.
Yeah, but it cannot track the population density of seed-dispersing birds beneath the canopy,
Hmm.
or the migratory movement of a herd.
You just can't see that from orbit.
No, you can't.
Yeah.
And the wider the frontier of what we price and protect, the more heavily the financial models must rely on the people who actually live in that frontier.
The local communities again.
Exactly. To track and manage that level of ecological detail, you absolutely require indigenous trackers and local community observation. It physically changes the labor structure of a climate project.
And the massive institutional architecture is slowly beginning to align with this local ecosystem-based focus. We saw a major signal of this on July 1st, 2026.
Ah, yes. The Global Environment Facility.
Right, the GEF officially opened its ninth funding cycle.
Which is huge, because the GEF is one of the most influential multilateral funds in this space. For their new cycle, their programming strategy for both the Least Developed Countries Fund and the Special Climate Change Fund made ecosystem-based adaptation the core spine of their strategy through 2030.
They are explicitly centering coastal protection, resilient livelihoods, and integrated land and water management.
The biggest institutional gears are really turning toward a model that requires local consent and local management.
So, what does this all mean for you? If you are navigating this space, building a project, or analyzing market trends, what should you be watching for?
The calendar for the rest of the year is going to serve as a massive testing ground. We are going to see if these community-first terms demanded at York actually make it into binding global treaties and standardized accounting metrics.
The schedule is basically a gauntlet of governance. In September, we have Climate Week NYC.
Right, and the briefings highlight this as the primary bellwether for whether corporate nature commitments will actually convert from PR language into real deployed capital.
Then, in October, attention shifts to the CBD COP17 in Yerevan, Armenia.
The Convention on Biological Diversity.
Exactly. Essentially the biodiversity equivalent of the big UN climate conferences. That is where the question of who pays gets put on a multilateral treaty agenda.
And following that, in November, the Nature-Based Solutions International Congress convenes in Paris.
That's the one expected to advance the exact monitoring, accounting, and equity methods that practitioners are struggling to implement right now.
Yes. At every single one of these meetings, the foundational question won't be, should we invest?
It will be, whose terms are we investing on?
Exactly.
Which brings us to the core takeaway for this deep dive. If you take one thing away from these briefings, let it be this. In the nexus of climate and nature, a theoretical proof of concept is no longer enough.
Not at all.
The science is undeniably clear, the financial appetite from private markets is massive, and the multi-billion-dollar institutional gears are turning.
But none of that capital survives if the project fails the legitimacy test on the ground. If you are designing a project or moving funds, sequencing your governance first is the only viable path.
Right. Local legitimacy, highly clarified land tenure, and deeply documented community consent, where FPSE is built directly into the revenue model, these are no longer optional best practices or, compliance checklists.
They are the absolute non-negotiable prerequisites before a single dollar is dispersed.
Because if you try to build a billion-dollar financial instrument without that local consent, you are building an incredibly complex machine with an operating system that is guaranteed to crash.
It might look brilliant on a spreadsheet in London, but the moment you try to execute it in a mangrove forest, the local realities will just dismantle it.
The capital simply will not stay.
It is a sobering reality for the market, but an entirely necessary correction. And, it leaves us with a rather profound question to consider.
Oh, what's that?
Well, if the multi-trillion-dollar financial markets are finally realizing that nature investments absolutely crumble without local community support, how long will it be before the financial world is forced to develop a metric to explicitly price and perhaps even trade the trust of indigenous and local communities?
Wow, that is a fascinating thought to leave on. Thanks for joining us for this deep dive. Keep questioning the consensus, look closely at who is really benefiting from the next green headline you read, and we'll see you next time.